Welcome to HIV The Morning After. I'm Dan Hall. I'm a documentary producer and director. I've spent my entire adult life watching ignorance and prejudice play out around HIV. And frankly, I'm tired of it. And I'm sure many of you are too. This podcast is an attempt to do something about that. Not through lectures or statistics, but by doing what I do best. Interviewing people and letting them tell their own stories. Real voices, lived experiences, no bullshit. These conversations matter, and if you think so too, please rate, review, and share HIV The Morning After. I can make these episodes, but I can't make people listen to them or find them on their algorithms. That bit's down to you. You can reach me at hivthemorningafter@gmail.com. Right then, let's get started. Today I'm speaking with Lord Chris Smith, a man who changed the course of British political and LGBTQ+ history, not once, but repeatedly. In 1984, with his hands visibly shaking, he became Britain's first MP to voluntarily come out as gay. In 1997, he became the world's first openly gay cabinet minister. And in 2005, he became the first UK MP to publicly disclose his HIV-positive status. And his story spans the darkest days of the epidemic through to the present, and it's a masterclass in what one doctor once told him: learn to live with life's uncertainties. Let's start from the beginning, Chris. It's lovely to have you.
It's great to be here, Dan.
Thank you very much. Now, before all the public pronouncements, before the cabinet position, when you're just Chris Smith the person, can you take us back to November 1984 and Rugby?
I had been elected as the MP for Islington South and Finsbury the previous year in 1983. I'd never made any particular secret of the fact that I was gay, but I hadn't ever stood up on a public platform and told the world. And during my first year in Parliament, I kept on thinking, at some point I really need to say something about this. But the only question was when and where would be the right place. I had a parliamentary colleague who was also gay, had never ever come out. He never ever did. But he had journalists sitting in cars outside his little block of flats all night long, recording who was going in and out. He had people rummaging in his dustbins. I just decided I didn't want to have that sort of homophobic scrutiny. And I realized that the only way of removing the story was to tell it yourself. I was invited to go up to the city of Rugby. It was a Saturday lunchtime, and the incoming Tory leader of Rugby Council had said that he was going to remove LGBT people from the things he would not discriminate against in his employment policies. Effectively, he was saying, I do not want LGBT people coming to work for Rugby Council. A lot of people were really upset about this, and they invited me to go up and speak at a rally on the Saturday lunchtime. And I can remember going up on the train and writing a very boring speech. I arrived at the meeting hall where the rally was happening. There were about 1,000 people there. As I walked up to take my place on the platform, I just thought this is the place to do it, because the issue here is about the ability of anyone no matter what their sexual orientation happens to be, to do an equally good job as anyone else working for Rugby Council. And I suddenly thought, actually, exactly the same applies to MPs. And so when it came my turn to speak, I stood up and I began my speech by saying, my name is Chris Smith. I'm the Labour MP for Islington South and Finsbury, and I'm gay. At which point the entire audience got to their feet and gave me a standing ovation. It's the only time I've ever had a standing ovation 20 seconds into a speech. And I have to say, I have never regretted that moment for a single instant ever since.
What I find incredible in that story is it was, I guess, considered acceptable enough that that person would even suggest that that's what they wanted to do with their council. That the tone of the country was that that was probably an acceptable thing to say, and just, you know, a bunch of activists and lefties might protest, but that it's thought that this would be something that people might want to hear.
And I think my sense is that between 1984, when you're absolutely right, it was regarded as perfectly, inverted commas, acceptable to make this sort of decision as a local authority, through to 1997, when the government changed and we began the process of equalising legislative provision for LGBT plus communities. Over the course of that 15-year period, I think public attitudes changed fundamentally. I have often thought that the people were actually way ahead of the politicians in the way they were viewing this. And that was not just because a few politicians and actors and film personalities had come out, but it was because ordinary people were coming out in their families, amongst their friends, in their workplace, in their neighbourhood.
I do always think that we'll know that we've got true acceptance when we're allowed to be dull. That if we're still expected to turn up at the table and be fashionable or beautiful or filled with wonderful stories, we're still performing. It's when we're allowed to be dull that I think we've properly got there.
Well, one of the things that I realised when I was appointed to the cabinet in 1997, and I was the first openly gay cabinet minister anywhere in the world, the rather wonderful thing was no one noticed. In all the commentaries about the new cabinet and who was doing what, no one ever mentioned this rather striking fact. But that showed me that we had indeed made a little bit of progress.
We're going to wind forward a little bit from rugby, and you've been 2 or 3 years as an out politician, as an out MP. What were you aware of this virus coming across? Rumours in America, news reports?
We had news of this virus and the disease, the diseases that it gave rise to. It was all something that was happening in America, and it was New York and San Francisco, and we were a little bit aware of it, but not very much. As it began to take hold here in the UK, we all got completely terrified, and we tried to find out a lot more about it. And the government were running the icebergs and tombstone adverts to try and generate public awareness. But those adverts were making us feel really terrified. We just didn't know enough.
Can you take us back to that moment when you thought, shit?
It certainly was an oh shit moment. I can remember the day that I was diagnosed. I received the news in the morning. That evening, I was in the division lobby in the House of Commons, and I can remember going up to the chief whip and saying, is it all right if I go home now? Because I have just had some rather bad medical news. I didn't tell him what it was. I deliberately told only about 10 or 15 friends. I did tell the people that worked in my office in Parliament, because I thought they ought to know in case anything did happen. But it was a moment when I just wanted to go home and bury myself in the bedclothes.
And who emerged from those bedclothes? Why didn't you stay there?
Because I had a job to do. I sort of determined that even if I was likely to die in 6 or 12 months' time, I wanted to do the very best I could during that period.
And your doctor said to you, you have to learn to live with uncertainty. Why did that make such an impression on you?
Remember, this was in the very early days before we even had AZT available. And I can remember him saying, I have no idea what is going to happen medically to you. You could get an opportunistic infection tomorrow, and that might be quite a rapid process. You could carry on living for quite a while and without any opportunistic infections. But he said, the thing is, you have to learn to live with uncertainty. And it was the best advice that anyone could have given me. And it's probably not bad advice for anyone, whether or not they have HIV.
Moving forward a little bit to the late 80s and to 1988, which I do think is probably one of my favourite years for music. There were so many good songs released in 1988 that I only feel sorry for you as an MP and politician. You were probably too busy to discover some of the corkers that came out that year.
Remember, I grew up in the 1960s, and I would argue just as good in the 1960s as 1988.
Well, you would, wouldn't you? But it's now 1988, and the Conservative government in power are bringing in Section 28, which we spoken a lot about on the show previously, and about the toxic effects that had on queer people and also on public health.
I can remember having to sit through all sorts of vile speeches in the House of Commons from the people who were proposing Section 28. They were constantly talking about how this was all about protecting children and so on. It was a really horrible period. And I can remember vividly there was one gathering we had in the House of Commons in one of the committee rooms. A lot of the campaigners from outside against Section 28 were there. And the 2 or 3 MPs who were leading the battle in the House were also there. And I can remember seeing this very attractive young man across the other side of the room. And even better, after the meeting was over, he came up to me and he was organising a conference and he wanted me to go and speak at it, which I wasn't able to do. But we ended up living together for 24 years and it was completely wonderful. It was the one good thing that came out of Section 28.
And it must have been surprising for you. Here you were just a year after diagnosis thinking that your life potentially was just going to gradually shut down until you died. And suddenly this, glorious door opens. It's like we were just saying, embrace uncertainty.
Yep. And of course, I told him all about my HIV status, and it wasn't easy for him either. And the partners of HIV positive people need virtually as much support as the HIV positive people themselves do. The first manifestation of the impact of HIV on me was Kaposi's sarcoma, a form of skin cancer, I think, that used to affect particularly elderly Jewish men, but suddenly it was cropping up in young people with HIV. The very visible signs that some people had and that appeared in lots of movies, especially movies like Philadelphia, that suddenly it was the purple lesion that identified the fact that the hero had AIDS. Fortunately, my Kaposi's sarcoma was on bits of my body that weren't visible to the public. So I never had purple lesions on my face, for example. You just hoped that it wouldn't spread elsewhere around your body. They prescribed alpha interferon for me. This was a really, really horrible drug. You had to inject it, and my partner at the time used to do the injection. For 24 hours, you felt absolutely rotten. You felt as if you had very, very bad flu. And then for 24 hours, you felt normal. And then you had to have another injection.
It must have been very difficult, though, dealing with those side effects whilst also having to have a very public job.
It was the most ghastly drug. And all the time I was out and about doing things as a political figure. It was quite tough in those days. But happily, after a year, they decided it wasn't doing any good at all. And so I came off it.
How on earth did you manage that? That's a year of oscillating day to day between feeling just normal, nothing better even, just normal, and feeling terrible, whilst throughout that entire year, I imagine as a politician, you don't really get much time off in a week.
No, you have to be up and happy and very public 24 hours a day.
Did you ever consider quitting? Did you ever just think this is too much?
No, I didn't. And even when combination therapy came along, and there were a couple of drugs that I was taking that produced violent diarrhea, I used to have to dive into a loo from time to time, and that was quite difficult to handle, even though it didn't make me feel as if I had very bad flu for 24 hours.
But that's incredible resilience. And whilst also dealing with the concern of, are these meds really working? I mean, that's the other side of it, isn't it? It's not just the side effects, it's the, is this actually doing anything? Because we were just hearing stories that people died, that there was just, the only thing that waited was death.
And that was certainly, in the very early days, that was the automatic assumption. The transformative effect of combination antiretrovirals coming along was just unimaginable, because suddenly there was hope. The side effects of the virus disappeared, and suddenly viral loads were indeed undetectable. And I mean, that transformational moment was something that really made everything possible after that.
You're very much a rising star, aren't you, within the British political landscape? Were you worried at any point that the rabid tabloid press were going to find out something and that you could be outed as being HIV positive?
Yes, I worried constantly about that. Whenever I went in for blood tests at Mortimer Market Centre, which was attached to UCH, I would look over my shoulder. Was there anyone lurking with a camera? But it didn't at that stage ever happen.
Was there ever a temptation from you to not remove yourself from office completely, but just take a less publicly facing role?
No, I never ever thought, sod this for a game of soldiers, I'm going to give up, because I was sort of determined to carry on and do the very best I could. I went into politics in the first place in order to try and change the world, and I wanted to carry on doing that.
And whilst you were in these positions of power, you were doing incredible things, you know, the free museum entries, creating Ofcom, and yet it then annoys me that so much of this you were having to do it with having to keep a part of you secret, whilst having to deal with this kind of pressure of the British public, or indeed the world, just stigmatizing you.
I had made a deliberate decision that, unlike coming out publicly as being gay, I wasn't going to say anything publicly about my HIV status, partly because health is a much more personal thing. And indeed, when I finally did decide to come out about having HIV, one of the things I very deliberately said was, I hope that what I've been able to demonstrate is that it is possible to live with HIV and lead a really worthwhile, fulfilled and fulfilling life whilst coping with this disease.
Did you ever feel that within the political party, as you rose higher and higher, that there was a need to inform, say, people at the very top of the party?
One of the questions I was asked when I finally did come out publicly was, have you ever told Tony Blair as Prime Minister? And the answer was no, I hadn't. Having HIV had no impact whatsoever on my ability to be part of the government and be Secretary of State for Culture.
Now, am I right in thinking that when you did decide to disclose your status publicly, that you got a telephone call from Nelson Mandela?
The germ of this had happened 2 years previously, because I had a phone call from a journalist on the Sunday Times saying, we're about to run a piece about your health status. I knew instantly what this was. They had discovered, I still don't know how they discovered, but they had discovered that I was HIV positive. And I said to the journalist, if you are thinking of running something on this, I need to speak with your editor. The editor of the Sunday Times at the time was John Witherow. And within half an hour, he'd phoned me, and I said, the information you have, yes, is correct. I am HIV positive. I have been HIV positive for the last 15 to 20 years. And you do realize, don't you, that revealing someone's health circumstances against their wishes is in flat contradiction of the editorial code that you are signed up to? He said, yes, and if you don't want us to publish anything, we won't. I said to him, look, that is absolutely agreed. And when at some point I will want to say something, I will do it with the Sunday Times. And so we made a bargain, effectively. And he was entirely honourable through all of this. He did very distinctly abide by the editorial code, and I take my hat off to him for that.
But you talk about this with the confidence of knowing that it worked out as you wanted it to, and and the tone of your voice is confident, and it's something that happened in the past and had a successful conclusion, as in they held the story, and then when you decided to disclose, you went and ran it with them. But at the time, you did not know. At the time, you must have felt like you were holding a hand grenade.
Yep. It was in danger of exploding instantly. And there was a nervous moment or two before I had that phone call. I kept my side of the bargain because 2 years later, in the aftermath of Nelson Mandela having made a speech at his son's funeral, his son had died of AIDS, and Nelson Mandela made this really powerful speech about how we must stop hiding this. We must be open about it. We must talk about it. We must bring it out into the open, because that is the only way in which we will defeat this disease. And I just thought, well, perhaps this is the time to do it. And I phoned the Sunday Times and I said, I'm ready to run with the story. They literally held the front page, and they made a really big splash about it. They covered it, I have to say, really well. And I was trying to make 2 points. One was, I have been able to live with HIV and do a pretty full-on job for the last 20 years or so. And the second thing was to say, in a perverse kind of way, I've been lucky, because I've had HIV in a country with a National Health Service, with the medical responses, with doctors who know about this disease, with the possibility of access to antiretroviral medication. And let's remember there are thousands of people around the rest of the world who don't have those facilities or that knowledge or that access to medication. That was all through the Sunday. And I walked into my parliamentary office on the Monday morning, and there was a little note on my desk. Please ring Mr. Mandela, with a telephone number. And I dialed the number, and there, picking up the phone at the other end, was Nelson Mandela, who said, I just wanted to say thank you. What you've done has made a real difference.
That's quite an incredible story. I remember that happening. I remember feeling like it was a real sea change moment away from the shadows. I hope that you do feel and did feel the importance of that moment and how hugely helpful it was to changing the conversation and the types of conversations we were having.
Well, you are far too kind to say so, but I remember one of the heartening things that happened was I got messages from people all over the country saying, thank you, you've given me hope and you've given me much greater confidence, and I'm living with HIV and I now feel a lot better about it than before.
So you've now been living with HIV for 38 years and you've just become Chancellor of Cambridge University. When you look at your life now, how does HIV figure in your daily reality, if at all?
I'm not yet on the injection that lasts for 6 months, which will be a game changer for people living with HIV. I do have to remember to take the medication, and I've been religiously observant about that. But apart from that, you just get on with life.
Now, I very much remember 1987 because it was the first time I ever went to a concert, and that was to see Madonna in the Who's That Girl tour at Wembley Stadium. And I remember during that concert, she had a huge message about HIV. She was protesting against the Pope, telling people not to use condoms. It really struck a chord with me, how impressed I was that she was using her voice and she was using her agency to support a community which was feeling incredibly stigmatized. And of course, 87 was not a good year for you, being the year that you received your diagnosis. Would you have thought in 87 that you would be here now?
I wouldn't have dreamed that I'd be alive 38 years later, let alone having done a lot of political and public service life and now being Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. I wouldn't have dreamed it was possible.
And you've sort of been, I think in your own words, an inadvertent trailblazer. What does that feel like? Is it exhausting? Is it exhilarating? Is it just a working day?
It is primarily just a working day. Being the first to do this and the first to do that, it makes you feel a little bit chuffed with yourself. But then you have to remind yourself that you are just a tiny cog in a huge machine, and you bring yourself back down to size again.
Do you still live with uncertainty, or is that transformed into something else?
The advent of combination therapy has transformed the nature of the uncertainty, but what none of us know is what someone who has lived for 38 years with HIV is going to face over the next 10, 15 years.
Now, this is the final portion of the episode where I like to take us to a space of remembrance. In my mind here, I always go to the garden at the London Lighthouse, which is now the Museum of Brands. The garden is still there and it's still an incredible place to visit. And I know that the ashes of many people have been scattered there. And this is where I'd like to offer for us to take a pause and remember someone who you would like remembered.
It's someone who was a very good friend, who died of AIDS back in the late 80s. I can remember going to visit him in the last few weeks. He was living with his sister up in the Peak District. He had always been a really larger-than-life character. He'd been full of the joys of existence, and he had shriveled. He was thin, he was gaunt, he was clearly going through a lot of pain and difficulty. I think the shock of seeing him like that was even greater than the subsequent shock of losing him altogether.
And Chris, if you could send a postcard to the world, what would you write on it?
Be yourself, be unafraid, and tell your story in your own way.
I have to say, just before we sign off, it's been fantastic doing this, and it feels like very much I've come full circle, because I remember meeting many times yourself and Dorian in the 1990s through our mutual friend John Muskelly, and as a young queer man in the early 90s, not sure where I stood on the line between being sort of frightened and should I just be quiet and just fit in, or should I get into activism and fight for rights, fight for inequities. It was meeting people such as yourself who are in positions of power, who are out, that inspired me to take the second option. And then as I experienced friends and lovers who were living with HIV, that kind of led me as well, not into just a queer activism, but into activism fighting HIV stigma. You were hugely influential, literally just being in a space and you giving me moments of your time and conversation, and Dorian doing the same, made a massive impact on me. And so it does feel wonderful that I've sort of come full circle and we're now having this conversation 30 years later. Chris, thank you so much for being my guest on this first episode of the second series of HIV The Morning After. You've been absolutely smashing.
Well, thank you, Dan.
If you were moved or informed by what you heard today, please help spread the word. Subscribe to HIV The Morning After and leave a rating and a review. It makes a huge difference in helping others to find it. Your support helps to amplify these experiences. If you'd like to get in touch, suggest a guest, or share your own thoughts, you can email me at hivthemorningafter@gmail.com. And remember, if you encounter HIV stigma in a bar, call it out. If you encounter it at work, call it out. If you encounter it online, call it out. Because if you don't, you're part of the problem. The theme tune is by Pauline Nidu at unstoppablemonsters.com. And many thanks to Murray Lang for his continued support. And thank you for listening. Join me next time for another important conversation on HIV The Morning After. I've been Dan Hall.